Late afternoon light bled gold across the ridges of Willow Bend, that tired little town clinging to its patch of earth like a stubborn weed. Dust clung to every porch rail and prayer. Even beauty had a hard time surviving here, and Maggie Rowe had long given up trying to chase it. She stood at the edge of her father's field, hands raw from turning soil that refused to yield. Her sleeves were rolled, her braid unraveling, her face freckled by sun and wind. The men at the feed store called her plain. The women called her proud. Maggie had learned not to correct either. Truth was, she didn't have time to care what anyone thought. The farm her father left behind after his heart gave out wasn't much, but it was hers. And she meant to keep it that way. That morning the plow had broken again. The horse strained in the harness, and Maggie muttered to herself, fixing the wooden handle with a strip of wire. She worked until her breath came short, until the horizon shimmered and blurred. The land had taken nearly everything from her, her father, her softness, her hope, but it hadn't taken her grit. At the general store later that day, Maggie traded eggs for seed. The place buzzed with gossip like flies over molasses. She heard her name float between two women near the pickle barrel. Poor thing, one said, still wearing her father's coat. No wonder she's still single. The other replied, voice dripping with pity. She'll end up old and alone, mark my words. Ain't no man wants to wake up next to that kind of face. Maggie's hands tightened around the basket handle, knuckles whitening. She didn't look their way. Didn't have to. She'd grown used to the whispers, like burrs that clung but never drew blood. Still, something deep in her chest tightened, the ache of being unseen yet always watched. The store's bell jingled. A shadow fell across the doorway. Tom Bennett stepped inside, his limp faint but noticeable, the metal brace on his leg catching a glint of light. Folks said he'd been shot through the knee during the border skirmishes, that the war had taken his steadiness and half his smile. His right hand bore the marks of fire, tight, shiny skin across the knuckles. Some said that's why he never danced, never courted. Too broken, too proud. He gave a polite nod to the storekeeper, then to Maggie as he passed by. Their eyes met briefly, hers guarded, his steady and calm like someone who'd learned the weight of silence. Outside, the air smelled of dust and tobacco. Tom was loading feed onto his wagon when Maggie stepped out. Need a hand with that? She asked, more out of habit than kindness. He smiled faintly. I reckon I should be the one asking that, she shrugged. Suit yourself. He studied her for a moment, not the way the others did with judgment or pity, but as though trying to see the story behind her eyes. You've got good land there, he said finally. Hard ground, but good bones. Good bones don't grow wheat, she replied dryly. Something like amusement flickered across his scarred face. Then maybe it needs someone just as stubborn. For the first time in a long while, Maggie felt her lips twitch toward a smile, but she caught herself and looked away. He tipped his hat and climbed into his wagon, driving off toward the stretch of fenced prairie just east of her property. By the time she reached home, the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the barnyard. She leaned against the fence, watching the last light fade over the Bennett ranch, a new house rising, rough-hewn but solid. Inside the farmhouse, silence waited. Only the tick of the mantel clock and the creak of the old chair her father once filled. She lit a lamp and stared at the calloused hands in her lap. No man had ever offered to hold them, not that she'd wanted one to. Yet something in that rancher's quiet gaze had unsettled her. He hadn't looked at her like a problem to fix, or a woman to pity, just a person. Outside, the prairie wind sighed through the dry grass, carrying with it the faintest note of something Maggie hadn't felt in years, possibility. But Willow Bend didn't forgive easily. The gossip had already begun, and by Sunday, half the town would be whispering about the plain girl and the lame rancher, who dared to exchange more than a glance. Sunday mornings in Willow. Ben carried a rhythm older than the town itself. Church bells starched collars, and judgment whispered softer than prayers. Maggie Rowe didn't much care for gatherings anymore. They'd been kinder when her father was alive, when folks still called her Henry Rose Girl instead of that plain farm widow who never married. She wasn't a widow. Not really, but pity had a way of rewriting truth. That morning, she hitched her wagon to Old Bess and rode into town, dust rising behind her like smoke. Inside the churchyard, clusters of townsfolk stood talking after service. She caught the tail end of a conversation that made her stomach twist. "The harvest dance will be at the Grange Hall next Sunday," said Mrs. Doolan, fanning herself. "Maybe this year Maggie'll finally grace us with her presence if someone's brave enough to ask her." Laughter rippled through the group. Maggie turned away, pretending she hadn't heard. She'd already decided not to go. Dances weren't for women like her, women who didn't fit the measure of beauty or charm. She busied herself helping Mrs. Cobb gather hymn books, trying to shake off the sting. But as she stepped outside, she caught sight of Tom Bennett leaning against the fence rail, hat tilted back, listening as a pair of ranch hands murmured near him. "Only reason he's buying up that old pasture," one man said, "is 'cause no woman in her right mind'd have him." Half crippled, half burned. Probably figures that row girl's his only chance. Maggie froze mid-step. Tom's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing just enough to show he'd heard, but he didn't say a word. He waited for the men to walk off before straightening, the lines in his face deep with restraint. Their eyes met again across the yard, hers filled with reluctant sympathy, his shadowed by quiet resolve. That evening, Maggie found herself sitting on the porch, watching the last streaks of daylight fade behind the cottonwoods. The air hummed with crickets. She should have been mending fence wire or checking the smokehouse, but her mind kept circling back to that scene at church, to the cruel laughter and the look in Tom Bennett's eyes. Somewhere down the road, a wagon creaked closer. When it stopped at her gate, her pulse jumped. Tom climbed down, hat in hand, looking almost uncertain. "Evening, Miss Rowe," she blinked. "Evening, Mr. Bennett, you lose your way?" "Not yet," he said with a small grin. "I came to ask if you'd join me at the harvest dance next Sunday." The words hit like a jolt. She laughed once, short and brittle. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said simply. "I want to." Maggie shook her head. "I don't dance, Mr. Bennett." He shifted his weight, the brace on his leg catching the lamplight. "Neither do I. But I figure if folks are going to stare, might as well give 'em something worth talking about." Her throat went dry. "You're kind, but you don't need to pity me." For the first time, his voice hardened, not cruelly, but like tempered steel. "I don't dance out of pity, Miss Rowe. I've done enough pitying for one lifetime, myself included." The porch went quiet except for the creak of the rocking chair and the faint hum of cicadas. She met his eyes then, really met them, saw the honesty there, unvarnished and steady. But old habits die hard. Maggie folded her arms, half a shield, half surrender. "You'll find someone else, I'm sure." "Maybe," he said, settling his hat back on. "But I wasn't looking for someone else." He tipped his brim and turned to leave. The sound of his boots on the gravel lingered long after the wagon wheels faded into the dark. Maggie sat there for a long time, the lamp flickering beside her. She replayed his words again and again. "I don't dance out of pity." And though she told herself it didn't matter, her chest betrayed her. Beneath the calluses and pride, something small and aching began to stir. By the time she blew out the lamp, she still hadn't decided whether it was foolishness or courage that made a man like Tom Bennett ask a woman like her to dance. But deep down, she already knew. Next Sunday, the question wouldn't haunt her half as much as the thought of saying no. The drought rolled in like a thief, slow, silent, and merciless. By mid-July, Maggie Rowe's fields looked more like cracked pottery than farmland. The wheat stalks bent in defeat, their color drained to the pale of old parchment. Each morning she walked the rows, whispering small prayers she didn't quite believe in anymore. When the well coughed up more dust than water, she set her jaw and decided to fix it herself. The next 2 days were a blur of aching arms, blistered palms, and mule-stubborn determination. She hauled bucket after bucket from the creek half a mile away, sweat stinging her eyes. Her father's old tools sat scattered around the pump, rusted, tired, much like her. By the third morning, Maggie stood staring down at the cracked wellhead, knowing she couldn't mend it alone. Her throat felt tight with more than thirst. That's when a familiar voice drifted from the fence line. "Ground looks meaner than usual." She turned. Tom Bennett leaned against the post, hat low, a coil of rope slung over his shoulder. "Come to admire the ruins?" she asked dryly. "Came to lend a hand," he said. "Word in town was you're trying to fix a well by yourself. Thought maybe you'd accept help before the ground swallows you whole." Maggie crossed her arms. "Didn't ask for anyone's charity. Didn't offer any." He gave a faint smile. "Just water and a strong back." For a long moment she studied him. His leg brace, his burned hand, the way he carried both without shame or apology. Finally, pride bent just enough for honesty to slip through. "Fine," she muttered. "You can help. But I don't want anyone thinking you're here out of pity." "Wouldn't dream of it," he said, setting his tools down. They worked through the afternoon beneath a sun that burned like judgment. Sweat streaked the dust on their faces. At first, silence filled the air, thick, awkward, uncertain, but slowly words began to rise between them like rain after drought. Tom told her about the war, how fire had taken his horse, how guilt had nearly taken the rest of him. "Couldn't stand looking at myself for a long while," he admitted quietly. "Didn't figure anyone else should have to either." Maggie paused in her digging. "Folks talk plenty about what they see," she said, "but they don't see much, do they?" He gave a small laugh, rough and low. "No, ma'am. They surely don't. By sunset they hit water. A thin trickle at first, then a clean rush that shimmered in the dying light." Maggie let out a sound halfway between a sob and a laugh. "Would you look at that?" she said, kneeling beside the pump. "She's alive again." Tom leaned on his shovel, grinning through the dirt and sweat. "Told you. Good bones." Later, they sat on the porch steps, sipping weak coffee and watching the stars spill across the dark. Crickets sang somewhere near the barn. Maggie found herself speaking without thinking, about her father's last days, about how she'd stayed up nights trying to keep his farm alive when he no longer could. Tom listened, not interrupting, just letting the words find air. "I used to think," she said softly, "if I worked hard enough, maybe the land would forgive me for not being what people expected." He glanced at her. "You don't owe this land or them anything." For the first time, she didn't argue. The next morning, he showed up again, bringing spare boards and nails to mend her fence. The day after, she returned the favor, teaching him how to graft apple branches from her old orchard. They traded skills, laughter, and the quiet ease of those who've known too much solitude. When she laughed at his lopsided attempt to ride her old mule, he grinned and said, "I'll have you know, I used to be a fine rider before this leg. And I used to be genteel," she shot back. "Guess life had other plans for both of us." For once, her words weren't bitter. They were light, teasing. By week's end, the gossips had new stories to chew on. They said Tom Bennett was spending too much time at the Rowe farm. They said Maggie had finally trapped herself a man. Maggie ignored them. So did Tom, because for the first time since either could remember, the sound of laughter on that hard patch of land felt stronger than shame. The night of the harvest dance crept upon Willow Bend like a storm no one could outrun. For a week, the town buzzed with chatter. The store windows glowed with lamplight, as women fussed over ribbons and men polished boots they hadn't worn since last year's barn raising. But Maggie Rowe told herself she wouldn't be going. Not this time. Not ever. She had chores enough to keep her busy. The fences still needed patching, and the last of the corn needed gathering. And yet, she couldn't shake the sound of Tom Bennett's voice that night on her porch. "I don't dance out of pity." The words lingered like a stubborn ember, refusing to die out. On the morning of the dance, she found herself standing before the mirror in her father's old bedroom. Her reflection stared back, honest, plain, sun-worn. The dress she'd mended for the occasion hung on the hook, faded blue calico patched near the hem, simple as a prayer. She laughed under her breath. "You're a fool, Maggie Rowe." But by sundown, that same fool was walking down the dusty road toward the Grange Hall. The sound of fiddles and laughter carried on the wind. Inside, the hall glowed warm and golden. Lanterns swayed from the rafters, the air thick with sawdust and the sweet bite of cider. The moment she stepped through the door, the chatter dipped. Eyes turned her way, curious, measuring, unkind. She nearly turned back. But then, across the room, she saw him. Tom Bennett stood near the musician's stage, dressed in a clean white shirt and dark vest. His limp was still there, but the man wore it like armor now, part of him, not his shame. Their eyes met across the crowded floor. He smiled, slow and sure, then started walking toward her. The murmurs rose like wind through dry grass. "Maggie Rowe? Here? With him? She ain't even—" The whispers stopped when Tom reached her. He bowed slightly, hat in hand. "Evening, Miss Rowe. Thought maybe you'd changed your mind." She swallowed. "Maybe I did." He held out his hand. "Then let's prove the town wrong, shall we?" Her fingers hovered, trembling slightly. Then she took his hand. The skin was rough, the grip steady. And in that touch, something shifted. The music struck up, a slow waltz, soft as twilight. Tom's steps were careful, deliberate. Hers were uncertain but earnest. They moved together, not graceful but honest. At first, Maggie kept her eyes down, feeling the stares burn her back. But when she dared to look up, she caught Tom watching her. Not her dress, not her hair, but her. "Relax," he murmured, voice low and warm. "We're just two people who've earned a dance." A laugh bubbled out of her, surprising them both. They stumbled once, twice, and when Tom's brace clanked against the floorboards, she snorted out a laugh she couldn't hold in. He joined in, and the room, once tight with judgment, began to soften. By the time the song ended, the whispers had fallen silent. For a moment, the whole hall seemed to breathe again. Tom guided her off the floor, both of them smiling like they'd gotten away with something sacred. "Guess we survived," he said. "Barely," she replied, still breathless, "but it was worth it." And later, as the night deepened, they sat outside on the steps of the hall. The stars stretched wide above them, the air cool and still. Tom leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You know," he said softly, "I almost didn't come tonight." She turned to him, surprised. "Why?" "Because I thought maybe I didn't deserve another chance at life, at being seen," he chuckled dryly. "But then I figured maybe neither of us should be hiding from it anymore." Maggie's heart gave a strange, steady ache. "You ever think," she asked, "that maybe we're both just too stubborn to stay broken?" He smiled at that, eyes glinting in the lamplight. "Reckon that's the best kind of stubborn there is." The fiddle struck up another tune inside, but neither of them moved. The night didn't need music anymore. In the distance, laughter carried over the prairie, light, easy, belonging to someone else. But here, on these worn steps, two souls who'd lived too long in silence found something new in the quiet between them. It wasn't love yet. Not quite. But it was the start of something that would hold, and though neither said it aloud, both knew. What began with one awkward dance would soon test everything they'd come to believe about worth, pride, and the courage to be seen. For a few bright weeks after the harvest dance, the air around Willow Bend seemed softer somehow. Maggie and Tom fell into an easy rhythm, shared work, quiet dinners, laughter that came uninvited. The town still talked, of course. It always did. But their words couldn't reach the fields where Maggie's rows of young wheat shimmered under the autumn sun, or the hillside where Tom's cattle grazed along the new fence they'd built together. It wasn't a romance of grand gestures, just two people learning how to breathe in each other's company. Sometimes, when Maggie came by to return a borrowed tool or a jar of preserves, she'd find Tom sitting on the porch sanding the edge of a new saddle. He'd glance up, a spark of quiet warmth in his eyes, and say, "You're just in time. Need someone to test this strap?" Other times, she'd catch him glancing toward her farm from his pasture, just watching the smoke rise from her chimney. In a place where gossip was currency, theirs was a kind of quiet defiance, love born not of beauty or reputation but of truth, the kind that takes root slow and deep. But good things in Willow Bend never stayed untested for long. It began with a whisper, like most trouble does. One afternoon, while Maggie was at the general store trading flour for lamp oil, she caught sight of two men near the counter. One of them was Clay Wilburn, a rancher whose land bordered Tom's on the western edge. He had a smooth tongue and a mean streak that ran deeper than any creek in the county. "Tell you, he's got it all planned," Clay was saying to the clerk. "Bennett's after her land. That spring on Rose's property, he wants the rights. Wouldn't surprise me if that dance nonsense was just his way in." The words struck like a slap. Maggie turned, face pale. "You best watch your mouth, Clay Wilburn," he smirked. "Just speaking plain. Men like him don't limp around unless they're looking for an easier way to make a living." The clerk shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Maggie's heart pounded. She wanted to shout, to tell them they were wrong, but a small, poisonous doubt crept in, thin as smoke. What if it were true? Tom had offered to fix her well. He'd helped mend her fences. He'd spent more time on her land than his own these past weeks. By the time she left the store, the whispers had already begun to ripple outward. That evening, when Tom rode up to her gate like he always did, Maggie didn't come out to meet him. He called her name once, twice. Finally, she stepped onto the porch, arms crossed, face cold as winter light. "What brings you here, Mr. Bennett?" He frowned. "Same thing that brings me most days, checkin'." "You're all right. You sounding formal now?" "Folks have been talking," she said tightly. "Saying you're after my spring. That you only help 'cause you want my water rights." For a moment Tom said nothing. Then his eyes hardened, not in anger, but hurt. "And you believe that?" "I don't know what to believe." The silence between them grew heavy. Wind stirred the dust around his boots. He looked away, jaw tense. "I didn't think I had to prove myself to you, Maggie." "Neither did I," she whispered, voice cracking. He nodded once, slow and final. "All right then." Without another word, he tipped his hat, turned his mule, and rode off into the dusk. Days passed. The space between their farms felt wider than the miles of prairie. Maggie threw herself into work, but her hands betrayed her, slower, clumsier. She caught herself looking toward the Bennett ranch more than once, hoping for a silhouette against the horizon. But there was nothing. In town, the whispers grew sharper. "Guess the war cripple found out she ain't got much left to steal." Maggie ignored them with her head high, but inside, the words sliced deep. When rain finally came, cold, heavy, relentless, it beat against her roof like punishment. She stood at the window, staring across the dark fields, the ache in her chest echoing each drop that hit the glass. Tom Bennett had walked away without defending himself, and she didn't know if that was pride or proof. Either way, the silence between them had grown louder than the storm outside, and Maggie Rowe, who'd once sworn she didn't need anyone, felt the hollowness of that lie for the very first time. The storm came without warning. One moment the sky was only heavy with gray. The next it broke wide open, thunder rolling over the valley, rain lashing sideways. Maggie Rowe barely had time to pull the chickens into the coop before the wind began tearing at the roof shingles. She fought her way to the barn, skirts plastered to her legs, hair whipping across her face. The animals inside were restless, the horse stamping, the cows bellowing in fear. A loose beam swung from the rafters, slamming against the wall with every gust. "Easy, girl," she shouted, tying the horse tighter. Lightning split the sky, blinding white, followed by the crack of thunder so close it rattled the boards. She reached for a rope to secure the gate, and that's when she saw it. The far fence, the one by the creek, was gone. Water had risen fast, flooding the lower pasture, swallowing the fence line whole. If it reached the barn, she'd lose the livestock and maybe the house. She ran into the downpour, mud sucking at her boots, rain stinging her eyes. The current from the creek tore through the field like an angry beast. She tried dragging one of the fence rails upright, but it slipped from her grasp and vanished downstream. "Maggie!" She froze, breath catching. The voice cut through the rain like a bell. Through the sheets of water, a horse approached, Tom Bennett's mule, lathered and soaked, and Tom himself, half-drenched, hat gone, eyes burning through the storm. "What in God's name are you doing out here?" he shouted. "Trying to save my fence," she snapped back, shoving against the rising water. He swung down from the saddle and waded toward her, his limp slowing him but not stopping him. "To hell with the fence, you'll be swept clean away. I can't just stand by." He reached her just as her foot slipped in the mud. His burned hand caught her wrist, rough and sure. "Then don't stand, move." Together they hauled the livestock toward higher ground, driving the frightened animals uphill as the storm roared around them. The wind tore branches from the trees, rain blurring everything into gray chaos. By the time they got the last calf through the gate, both of them were shaking from cold and exhaustion. The barn loomed ahead, half collapsed, the lantern inside flickering weakly. They stumbled through the door and slammed it shut behind them. For a moment, they just stood there, breathing hard, rainwater pooling at their feet, thunder pounding in their ears. Maggie pressed a hand to her chest. "You shouldn't have come." Tom leaned against the wall, soaked and mud-splattered, eyes searching hers. "Couldn't stay away. Not when I saw that creek rising from my place." She shook her head, half angry, half trembling. "After what I said, after what the town's saying, you still came?" "Didn't come for them," he said simply. "Came for you." Her throat tightened. "Why?" "Because," he said quietly, "I meant every word I ever told you. I never wanted your land, Maggie. Just your company. But if you can't believe that—" He stopped, catching his breath. "Then I'll keep showing you until you do." Lightning flashed, illuminating the barn, the wrecked walls, the trembling horse, the two of them standing amid ruin and rain. Maggie's eyes burned. "I was afraid," she whispered. "Afraid you'd see me the way they do. The plain one. The fool still trying to hold on to dead land." Tom stepped closer, rain dripping from his hair. His voice softened. "I never did." The storm raged, wind howling through the cracks, but inside the barn, something broke loose that wasn't wood or nail. It was the silence between them, the pride that had kept them apart. For a long while, neither spoke. The only sound was rain hitting the roof, steady as a heartbeat. Maggie reached up, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. "I thought if I worked hard enough, maybe I'd earn respect. But maybe all I earned was loneliness." Tom shook his head. "No. You earned every soul's envy in this valley. They just don't dare to admit it." The words came out rough, honest, unpolished, like him. Maggie felt something in her chest shift again, the ache that had lived there for years easing at the edges. She stepped forward until her hand rested lightly on his arm. Outside, the thunder rolled one last time before fading eastward. When the dawn finally broke, the sky was washed clean, the fields glistening under a pale sun. The fences were ruined, the pasture flooded, but the farm still stood, and so did they. Tom turned toward the door. "We've got work to do." Maggie nodded, voice steady now. "Then we'll do it. Together." That single word, together, hung in the cool morning air like a vow. The storm had taken their fences, but left behind something stronger. The truth that neither of them had to face another flood alone. And in that truth, Maggie Rowe found more than survival, she found peace. For 3 long weeks after the storm, the valley smelled of wet earth and rebirth. The fences were half gone, the crops beaten down, and the barns bruised. But the people of Willow Bend still rose with the dawn, because that's what frontier folk did. And every morning Maggie Rowe rose with them. Only now, she didn't rise alone. Tom Bennett came by at first light each day, his mule pulling a cart of tools, lumber, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Together they rebuilt her fences post by post, plank by plank, the sound of hammers and laughter carrying across the field. The first few mornings the neighbors stopped to stare from the road. By the end of the week even the gossip had gone quiet. Word spread. How Tom helped Maggie rebuild. How Maggie worked beside him like a storm herself, sleeves rolled and eyes alight. Some whispered he meant to marry her. Others said she'd bewitched him. But those who watched closely saw something different. Two souls who'd stopped pretending to be less than they were. On the fourth morning, as the sun broke clean over the ridge, Tom drove the last fence post into the ground and leaned on his hammer with a grin. "Well, Miss Rowe," he said, wiping sweat from his brow, "that's the last of it." She stepped back, surveying the stretch of new fence gleaming pale against the green rise. "Sturdiest thing this land's seen since Pa's time," he chuckled. "Then we'll call it even. Your orchard saved my cattle last spring." "Even?" she echoed, half smiling. "You've done more than I can repay." He looked at her then, long and quiet. "Don't aim to be repaid, Maggie." Her breath caught. There was something in his voice that felt like a promise, low, steady, unspoken. She turned quickly to hide the heat in her cheeks. They worked the rest of the day in easy silence until the sound of wagon wheels came up the trail. It was Reverend Cole, his horse trotting slow beside him. "Afternoon, Miss Rowe, Bennett." The Reverend tipped his hat. "Word's out you two rebuilt half this valley between you. Folks are calling it a blessing." Tom smiled. "Not sure about blessings, Reverend. Just good hands and stubborn hearts." Reverend Cole chuckled. "That's near enough to the same thing." His eyes twinkled. "And speaking of blessings, don't forget another Sunday is gathering this week. Seems the Grange Hall survived the storm better than most." Maggie's stomach fluttered. Another dance. Another chance for the whole town to look, to whisper, to judge. But when she glanced at Tom, he was already watching her, the faintest smile tugging at his mouth. "Guess we've got our invitation," he said. She laughed softly. "You really think I'm walking into that hall again after what they've said?" He shrugged. "Let 'em talk. We've already outworked every rumor they've got." Sunday came warm and clear. Maggie dressed in that same blue calico, mended now with care instead of shame. When she reached the Grange Hall, she nearly faltered until Tom's hand found hers before they even crossed the threshold. Inside, heads turned as before, but this time, the air felt different. Tom led her to the floor with quiet confidence, his limp steady, her chin lifted. The music began, an old waltz with the same fiddler as last time. Their steps found each other easily now, no nerves, no pretense. Just movement, simple and true. Halfway through the song, Maggie realized something startling. No one was whispering. The room had gone still, but not in mockery, in awe. The man they'd called broken, and the woman they'd called plain, moved as if they'd been made for the same rhythm all along. When the music ended, Tom didn't let go of her hand. Instead, he turned to the crowd, his voice carrying clear and steady. "Reverend Cole," he said, "you might as well bless what everyone here's already seen. This woman's been my partner in work and in heart. I aim to make it official." A hush rippled through the hall. Maggie's eyes widened, but Tom's expression never wavered. Gentle. "Sure, true. Only if she'll have me," he added, voice soft enough that only she might have heard it. For a long moment, Maggie could only stare at the man who'd stood beside her through gossip, drought, and flood. Then she smiled through the blur of tears and said, "I reckon I already do." Laughter and applause broke like a dam. The fiddle struck up again, faster now, joyous. The townsfolk, once sharp with judgment, began clapping along, hesitant at first, then with growing warmth. Tom and Maggie danced again, the floorboards shaking under their boots, the crowd circling in laughter and light. Outside, the wind carried the sound across the valley, sweeping through the orchards and over the rebuilt fences. A song of new beginnings and the kind of love that doesn't ask to be admired, only proven. Then autumn came gently to Willow Bend that year. The cottonwoods along the creek burned gold, and the air turned crisp with the scent of ripe apples. From dawn till dusk, laughter echoed across the Roe Bennett farm, once a patchwork of failure and solitude, now a living thing that breathed hope. Maggie stood in the orchard one morning, sleeves rolled and hair tied back with a faded blue ribbon. A bushel basket leaned against her knee, full of the first apples from the trees she and Tom had grafted together in the spring. Tom approached from the barn, walking more easily these days. The limp was still there, but softer now, as if the earth had decided to meet him halfway. "Never thought I'd see these trees bear fruit this soon," he said. Stopping beside her, she smiled, brushing dirt from her cheek. Guess they just needed a little tending and someone to believe they could. He took an apple from her basket, turning it over in his rough hand. "You're talking about more than trees, Maggie." Her eyes met his. "Maybe I am." He grinned and took a bite, juice running down his thumb. "Sweet," he said. "Just like you promised," she laughed softly. "Don't you start saying things like that or the whole valley'll start thinking you've gone soft." Tom looked toward the ridge where the church steeple shone white in the distance. "Let 'em think what they like. Folks'll always talk, least now they're saying something worth hearing." And the Sunday gatherings had changed too. Where once Maggie sat in the shadows, now she was at the center, pouring cider, laughing with children, helping Mrs. Cole serve pies to the field hands. The same women who once called her plain now sought her advice on grafting fruit trees and mending fences. They said her hands had a magic that turned broken things useful again. When the men spoke of Tom Bennett, it wasn't of his limp or his scars, it was of his steadiness, his work ethic, the way he and Maggie had brought 2 dying farms back to life. Together, they'd become something larger than rumor could hold, proof that hard work and kindness could outlast vanity and pride. One afternoon near harvest's end, Maggie sat on the porch sewing patches into a tablecloth while Tom whittled beside her. The sun dipped low, painting the fields in honey light. She glanced up and said quietly, "Tom, do you ever think about how it all began? That first day at the store?" He chuckled. "How could I forget? You nearly bit my head off when I asked you to the dance, Gunk. You deserved it," she teased. "You looked too sure of yourself." "I wasn't sure," he said, his tone softening. "I was scared stiff you'd say no," she set her stitching down. "And I almost did, for all the wrong reasons." He looked at her, his eyes gentle. "Maybe all that mattered was you said yes when it counted." They sat in silence for a long while, the kind that feels like peace. From across the valley, faint fiddle music drifted on the wind. Someone somewhere was practicing for the next Sunday dance. Tom rose and extended his hand. "What do you say, Mrs. Bennett? One more dance before supper?" Maggie laughed, shaking her head. "Here in the dirt?" He shrugged. "Seems it's treated us kindly enough." She took his hand. "Then let's not waste it." Barefoot in the yard, they swayed slowly beneath the orange sky. The wind stirred the apple trees around them, their branches whispering like an old hymn. Tom's arm fit easily around her waist. Her head rested against his shoulder. No crowd, no music, just 2 souls who'd earned their peace. As the last light faded, Maggie whispered, "You ever think we were meant for this?" He smiled. "No, I think we built it." Weeks later, at the annual harvest fair, the preacher told the crowd that Maggie Rowe and Tom Bennett's place had brought in the valley's finest yield. When the applause came, Maggie didn't blush or hide. She only looked to Tom, who was already smiling at her, proud, quiet, whole. In that moment, it didn't matter what anyone had ever said about her face, her hands, or her worth. The truth was here, in the land they'd healed and the life they'd built. They hadn't just survived Willow Bend, they'd changed it. And if love had a face, it wasn't always the fairest one in town. It was the one that showed up at dawn, rolled up its sleeves, and stayed when the storms came. Tom leading the mule. Maggie carrying a pail of apples, two figures walking side by side, steady as the land itself. And as the wind swept through the valley, you could almost hear it say, "Beauty fades, but truth once chosen holds forever." If you felt Maggie and Tom's story warm your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes real love is built, not found. More Wild West stories of courage and kindness coming soon.